The Impossible Mission of Kuribayashi. The summer of 1944 marked the destiny of a man and of an island that would soon become synonymous with death. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was summoned in Tokyo, aware that what would be asked of him had no return. Japan was bleeding on all fronts. The Marianas had fallen, the American aircraft carriers dominated the Pacific, and the Allied advance was dangerously approaching the archipelago. The next battle would take place in Iwo Jima, a piece of volcanic rock of barely 8 square miles, but situated in the straight line between Saipan and Tokyo, the last obstacle before the heart of the empire. It was the first properly Japanese land threatened by invasion, and the government decided to entrust its defense to a man who combined samurai discipline with an uncommon experience. He had known the United States up close, had traveled through its cities, and had warned since then that it would be a mistake to underestimate them. Kuribayashi had been a military attaché in Washington in the 1930s, had traveled through Texas, through New York, through Canada, and in each letter to his wife he repeated the same idea. The United States is the last country with which Japan should go to war. Its industry is immense, its men are tough, and when they decide to fight, they do so with a tenacity that cannot be measured in numbers. That warning became his own condemnation. When Premier Tojo informed him that only he was qualified to defend Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi understood that he was accepting an impossible mission. There would be no return, and he knew it from the moment he left his house without carrying the ancestral family sword or the imperial saber received upon graduating from the Staff Academy. To his brother he left a letter that was at the same time a testament. He promised to fight to the end and not stain the Kuribayashi surname with dishonor. The first contact with the island was deceptive. In June, there was still vegetation on the slopes of Suribachi. The village children waved flags in greeting, and some sugarcane fields and orchards gave the illusion of fertility. But soon the sulphurous fumaroles, the thick air, and the absence of fresh water revealed to him the harshness of the place. Iwo Jima was a volcanic hell condemned to become a fortress and a tomb. The alarming thing, however, was not the terrain, but the absolute lack of organization. Sailors, aviators, and soldiers coexisted under rival commands, each corps defending its privileges. The general immediately understood that before thinking of resisting, he had to impose discipline and unify the defense, and he did it against all Japanese military doctrine. Instead of placing the artillery pieces on the beach, he ordered them withdrawn inland towards Suribachi and the northern plateau, aware that an American landing could not be stopped on the shore, as Normandy, Saipan, and Tinian had demonstrated. His first order generated violent protests. The Navy officers could not conceive of abandoning the coastline, and those of his own staff accused him of betraying tradition. But Kuribayashi did not yield. If he wanted the island to resist, he had to break with dogma, not waste the forces in an immediate suicide, but wear down the enemy step by step in a slow retreat that would transform each hill, each tunnel, and each cave into a deadly trap. Unlike other commanders who had launched banzai charges condemning thousands to die in a matter of hours, he prohibited those desperate attacks. There would be no glory in a last cry at dawn. What he sought was for each Japanese soldier to kill 10 Marines before falling. His vision was not romantic, it was calculated, cold, almost mathematic. The slogan was simple: to turn Iwo Jima into a slaughterhouse that would wear down the will of the United States. For that, he undertook a colossal engineering project. He ordered the excavation of more than 20 kilometers of tunnels under the volcanic soil, connecting positions, trenches and caves in an underground system that would allow the troops to reappear in unexpected places. Each hill was transformed into a nest of machine guns, each slope into an armored wall. Tanks were buried as immobile forts, false positions were built to deceive aviation, and reserves of ammunition were prepared would allow them to resist for weeks without resupply. Kuribayashi knew that there would be no ships or planes to rescue him. The the sea was controlled by the American Navy and the sky by the aircraft carriers. That is why he insisted on a self-sufficient defense, designed to last as long as possible at the cost of the blood of his men. The enemy did not take long to verify. Since June of 1944, the American aircraft carriers began air attacks that destroyed the few fighters that remained on the island. In a matter of days, the Japanese air unit was annihilated. Without fleet, without aviation, without reinforcements, the only thing left was the land and the men. The arrival of the 145th Infantry, about 2,700 soldiers from Kagoshima, was received by the general as a relief. They were considered among the best of the empire. But soon the rest of the reinforcements made it clear that the quality was uneven. Inexperienced recruits, senior officers without training, demoralized sailors. With that mosaic, he had to build a garrison of 21,000 defenders. To them were added thousands of forced Korean laborers, turned into manpower to dig tunnels and drag cannons by sheer strength of arms. Kuribayashi constantly toured the positions, imposing respect with his corpulence and with the mixture of severity and camaraderie that he transmitted. He spoke to them of the horses he had ridden in his cavalry years, of his travels to the United States, of his conviction that it was impossible to defeat that enemy but necessary to make him pay an unbearable price. His leadership did not appeal to imperial fantasy nor to the hope of victory. It appealed to duty and the honor of resisting. Many looked at him with distrust for his unorthodox method, but his firmness ended up prevailing. The mission he accepted in June of 1944 was already written in advance. Iwo Jima had to be defended to the last man. He himself knew it. He had left his sabers at home because he did not expect to wield them again. When he wrote to his 10-year-old daughter, he did so with large strokes so that she could read by herself. "Your father has a very hard task and perhaps will not return. I only worry that you grow up healthy and help your mother." It was the confession of a condemned man. He did not fight for victory, but to prolong defeat, to demonstrate that even without planes, without ships, without hopes, Japan could immolate itself in a sacrifice that would resound in Washington. The impossible mission of Kuribayashi consisted in transforming a sulfurous rock into the tomb of two armies. He and his men would die there, but his objective was that the enemy would also leave thousands of bodies on the black sand. The largest landing of the Marines. The dawn of February 19th of 1945 revealed over the Sea of Iwo Jima one of the most imposing fleets that had ever sailed the Pacific. For hours, a horizon covered with ships began to unfold in perfectly calculated rows. Battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft, supply ships. More than 485 war and transport ships had gathered to launch the Marines onto an island of barely 20 square kilometers. Never before had the Corps assembled such a number of men and means for a single blow. In total, more than 70,000 Marines were preparing to jump onto the black sand under the code name of the operation Detachment. Since dawn, the battleships and cruisers had been firing against Suribachi and the northern plateau of the island, attempting to uproot the Japanese fortifications. Columns of thick smoke rose from the volcanic soil while the 16-inch shells made the earth tremble, and with each explosion the fleet expected deadly craters to open for the enemy. To this were added the aircraft carriers that since the day before had launched waves of dive bombers and fighters that fired rockets against positions previously identified in aerial photograph. The American officers trusted that such punishment had annihilated all organized resistance. General Holland Smith himself expected a violent but brief opposition. 10 days of fighting, perhaps less, would be enough to secure Iwo Jima. The first waves of amphibious vehicles began to head toward the coast shortly after 9 in the morning. They advanced in successive waves, with the LVTs loaded with infantry and heavy weapons behind the first engineer units. From the sea, the men could clearly distinguish the silhouette of Suribachi to the left, that conical mountain that dominated the entire landscape. The Marines were crowded inside their transports, faces covered with sweat and sand, while the roar of the engines and the clatter of naval artillery marked the rhythm of the approach. The beach, however, turned out to be the first trap. The black and soft sand, composed of volcanic ash, absorbed every step and every shovel as if it were burning ashes. The landing craft became stuck, the tanks could not advance, and the machines sank as soon as they tried to climb the slopes. The Marines were forced to climb with inhuman effort, dragging ammunition and wounded while the waves retreated and returned to cover the shoreline. There was no coral nor reefs as in Tarawa, but the difficulty was equally desperate. The surprising thing in those first hours was the silence. Unlike other islands, the initial landing was not received with an immediate rain of bullets and grenades. The Marines advanced a few meters inland without encountering organized resistance. Many thought that the previous bombardments had worked better than expected, that the artillery and aviation had pulverized any opposition. Some even began to organize cordons and ammunition depots on the beach with a certain calm. That illusion lasted only minutes, when the third and fourth waves of landing began to crowd on the coast and the beaches were packed with men, vehicles, barrels, and boxes of ammunition. The inevitable occurred. From the slopes of Suribachi and from the northern plateau, thousands of hidden mouths of fire opened at the same time. Heavy machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces camouflaged in caves, rockets, and snipers unleashed a concentrated hell over the beaches. It was the trap designed by Kuribayashi to let the enemy pile up without space to maneuver and, at that moment, to unleash a storm of crossfire. The chaos was immediate. The Marines ran forward, sinking in the sand, falling at each step from the shrapnel that bounced on the beach like a rain of iron. The Sherman tanks tried to make their way, but many were destroyed in seconds by hidden anti-tank cannons. The engineer units in charge of clearing obstacles were swept away by invisible bursts. Blood began to dye the shore dark red while the tide carried and returned shattered bodies. The largest landing in the history of the Marines was turning into a slaughterhouse. Even so, the American machinery did not stop. With brutal discipline, the waves continued to arrive, unloading men and supplies without rest. The officers shouted orders above the deafening roar of the cannons, pushing the men toward the ash terraces that they had to overcome to get out of the direct reach of the machine guns. Each meter was conquered at an unimaginable cost, with flamethrowers and grenades thrown against the caves that vomited fire. The magnitude of the landing surpassed any previous effort in the Pacific. In a matter of hours, tens of thousands of Marines were compressed into a strip of barely 500 meters of depth. The support ships, aware of the danger, approached as much as possible to unload naval fire almost point blank, risking falling within reach of the hidden cannons. Communication was chaotic, the radios saturated with calls for help, casualty reports, and requests for ammunition. What had begun as an operation that was supposed to be fast and overwhelming was transformed from the first day into the confirmation of the darkest fears. Iwo Jima would not be a quick conquest, but a prolonged slaughter. The largest landing of the Marine Corps had begun, and with it opened a scenario of 36 days where each meter would be paid for with blood. The black and cursed beach. From the sea, the Marines had seen those beaches as a dark strip that contrasted with the blue of the ocean and the conical profile of Mount Suribachi. What they could not imagine was that that black sand, so different from that of Tarawa or Guam, would be one of their cruelest enemies. It was not common sand, but loose volcanic ash, deep and rough, that swallowed boots, devoured shovels, and stopped vehicles as if they were toys. Each step forward required an excessive effort. The ground gave way and slid under the feet, forcing the men to advance as if they were walking on burning ashes. The landing had begun with the hope the beach would be secured in a matter of hours, but nature conspired with the defenders. The Sherman tanks and amphibious transports got stuck as soon as they tried to climb the slopes. The treads spun uselessly while the sand sank under their own weight. The engineers, with their bulldozers and mechanical shovels, tried to open path. The ground swallowed every effort. Even the trenches, which were supposed to protect the Marines, collapsed as they were dug. The volcanic sand offered no support. It crumbled over the men, forcing them to start again and again. It was in that scenario that the Japanese strategy revealed its sinister perfection. During the first minutes of the landing, the defenders remained silent, allowing thousands of men to crowd into a reduced space without cover, trapped between the sea at their backs and the slope in front of them. When the beaches were saturated, the trap closed. Artillery, mortars, machine guns and anti-tank cannons opened fire from camouflaged positions on the slopes and terraces. The sand became a vibrant hell of shrapnel. The volcanic ground amplified the horror. Bullets and shells raised columns of black dust blinded the Marines, while the newly formed craters were swallowed almost instantly by the loose sand. The wounded who fell were dragged backward by their companions, but each movement was slow and exhausting, as if all were trapped in an invisible snare. The beach offered no cover. The bodies piled up, the ammunition boxes exploded under enemy fire, and the landing trucks burned like torches. The officers, aware of the danger, pushed their men inland toward the terraces that dominated the beach. But climbing those slopes was another torment. The Japanese machine guns had been placed with precision to cross their fire in deadly fans. Every meter gained was within the reach of 2, 3, or more hidden positions. The Marines advanced barely a few steps before having to throw themselves to the ground, sinking up to their knees in the black sand, with no possibility of digging a safe shelter. The contrast with Suribachi, which rose like an imposing shadow on the left flank, accentuated the feeling of doom. From its caves and galleries, the Japanese fired at the beach as if from a balcony, observing every movement, adjusting their cannons calmly. The beach was an open slaughterhouse where the enemy had the advantage of height and invisibility. Each subsequent landing, each wave of reinforcements, fell into the same funnel of fire. The testimonies coincide in the same impression. There was no safe place, there was no possible direction. The volcanic sand not only swallowed the hopes of advancing, but seemed to expel blood in every corner. The bodies, covered with black dust, blended with the terrain, and many wounded were half buried while trying to crawl. The heat of the ground, laden with sulfur, added another torment. The air smelled of gunpowder, blood, and sulfur, as if the volcano itself had awakened to demand sacrifices. The black and cursed beach of Iwo Jima was engraved in the memory of those who survived as the first circle of hell. There was no glory nor heroic advance, but a desperate struggle to get out of the sand before being killed. That dark strip, apparently harmless seen from the ships, became the symbol that the battle would be much more than a landing. It would be a descent into a cursed land where every grain of sand seemed to conspire with death. Mount Suribachi, symbol and cemetery. Mount Suribachi dominated Iwo Jima like an eternal lookout. Rising in conical form at the southern end of the island, it was an imposing shadow that all the Marines glimpsed from the sea long before touching the beach. That mountain, seemingly calm and mute, was in reality a bastion of steel and rock, turned by Kuribayashi's strategy into a hive of death. To take Suribachi was not only a matter of tactics, it was to break the enemy's pride, to tear from them the watchtower from which they controlled every meter of the Black Beach, every movement of the tanks, every attempt to advance inland. The landing of February 19th made it clear that as long as Suribachi remained in Japanese hands, the coast would never be secure. From the first hours, the volcanic cone became a beacon of fire. Machine guns hidden in caves, artillery pieces embedded in reinforced tunnels, invisible mortars firing from the slopes. The entire mountain behaved like a living fortress, breathing death in bursts that fell upon the beach and the ash fields. The Marines soon understood that the volcano could not be ignored. It had to be taken, and quickly. The problem was how. Suribachi was not a simple hill. It was a labyrinth dug over months. Deep tunnels, some capable of housing entire companies, connected the hidden entrances at different levels. The Japanese could appear and disappear like ghosts, fire from one point and retreat underground before the naval artillery or aviation could reach them. Every crater was a mouth of fire, every rock a refuge of invisible soldiers. The mountain was alive, and its black skin of hardened lava was transformed into a field of ambushes. During the first days, the Marines tried to surround the cone, establish blocking positions, and advance little by little toward the slopes. But every meter gained cost dozens of dead. The heat of the volcanic soil, impregnated with sulfur, turned the ascent into torment. The air was unbreathable, filled with smoke, dust, and the smell of gunpowder. The noise was constant, explosions that made the rock tremble, machine guns hammering the air, cries of wounded that mixed with the rumble of naval artillery firing from the sea. The engineers played a key role. With flamethrowers, demolition charges, and explosives in hand, they opened the way by sealing tunnel mouths or setting fire to the caves where the defenders entrenched themselves. Many of these combats took place just meters away, often in the shadows, where hand grenades became the currency of exchange and the fire of the flamethrowers illuminated the passages like torches of hell. The horror multiplied. There were no clear front lines, but rather a blind advance, groping toward an enemy that could be above, below, or to the side. The battle for Suribachi lasted for 5 days. Each day, the Marines climbed a few meters more, barely reaching new terraces or secondary hills. The terrain was hostile and treacherous. The volcanic rock was full of cracks and crevices that offered natural hiding places for the defenders. The naval artillery, although devastating, scarcely managed to damage the underground galleries. The aerial fire with bombs and rockets lifted clouds of ash, but the Japanese re-emerged as soon as the smoke dissipated. The suffering was indescribable. The heat of the day, the ash that entered the eyes and the mouth, the lack of water and rest, the constant smell of bodies that remained abandoned on the slopes. Everything contributed to turning the mountain into an open cemetery. Many Marines died before even reaching half of the ascent. Others were wounded in places impossible to rescue, trapped between the black sand and the incandescent rock. Each night, the slopes were strewn with motionless shadows, mixed with the remains of equipment, destroyed weapons, and pieces of scorched uniforms. On February 23rd, finally, the summit was reached. A detachment of the 28th Regiment of the 5th Division of Marines managed to climb to the edge and secure it after intense combats inside the higher tunnels. It was then that the image that would forever mark history took place. 6 Marines raised an American flag over a metal bar at the top of the volcano. Joe Rosenthal, photographer of Associated Press, captured the exact moment in which the national symbol rose against the sky, supported by the inclined bodies of the soldiers. The photograph, which traveled the world in a matter of days, became an icon of the war in the Pacific. In the United States, it was received as a sign of imminent victory, as proof that the Japanese resistance had been broken. For the Marines on the beach, however, it was only a brief respite. Suribachi was taken, yes, but the battle for the island was far from over. The flag waved over a cemetery. Hundreds of men lay on the slopes, half buried in the ash or sealed in the tunnels that had collapsed after the explosion. The Japanese defenders fought until the last instant. Many refused to surrender and were hunted one by one in the galleries, while others killed themselves with grenades before being captured. General Kuribayashi, who was never in Suribachi, his command post was to the north, had ordered resistance until the end, and his men carried out that instruction with fanaticism. The mountain, turned into a symbol of defense, was also the tomb of its guardians. For the Marines, the conquest of Suribachi represented a psychological triumph. To have seized that hill meant cutting the enemy's eyes over the beach, guaranteeing that the later landings would not remain under the constant harassment of machine guns and mortars from the south. But it also represented a lasting trauma. Every soldier who survived remembered the smell of sulfur, the hot air that burned the lungs, the cries of their comrades trapped in sealed tunnels. Suribachi was not only a mountain, it was a brutal reminder that every advance in Iwo Jima was paid for with blood. The flag waving over the volcano was celebrated in the rear, but for those who were there, that image was tinged with death. Many of the men who raised it would not survive the entire campaign. The mountain, although conquered, continued breathing like an open cemetery, full of galleries that still hid defenders willing to die, full of bodies that would never be recovered. The symbol rose over the collective grave of thousands, Japanese and Americans alike. Suribachi was the first great obstacle of the Battle of Iwo Jima, and its conquest marked the tone of what would come afterward. What was supposed to be a rapid operation revealed itself as an endless slaughter. The Black Mountain, conquered after 5 days of infernal combat, remained as the cruelest reminder. In Iwo Jima, every victory would be torn at an unbearable price, and every symbol would be raised over a cemetery. The war underground. When the Marines believed that the conquest of Suribachi secured the island, they soon discovered what they had seen on the surface was merely a mirage. Iwo Jima was not defended from open trenches nor from visible lines, as on other islands of the Pacific. There, the true enemy was hidden under their feet. The battle was fought not so much on the black sand as in the entrails of the volcano. It was a subterranean war, patiently designed by General Kuribayashi, who turned the island into a labyrinth of tunnels, caves, and galleries where death appeared from nothing. For 8 months, thousands of Japanese soldiers, engineers, and Korean laborers had excavated a secret world under the rock. With dynamite, picks, and bare hands, they perforated more than 20 kilometers of interconnected tunnels reinforced with logs and concrete. Those galleries could house up to 1,000 men in some sectors, with food, ammunition, and water stores carefully hidden. The cannons were concealed behind sliding doors of steel or stone and appeared only to fire before disappearing again. From the air, the island seemed destroyed by the bombings. In reality, the garrison remained almost intact, crouched in the darkness. For the Marines, this meant entering into an unprecedented combat. Every meter of advance was deceptive. A position was cleared with grenades and rifle fire, but as soon as one turned their head, new bursts appeared from another angle. The mouths of the tunnels opened like wounds in the earth, small cracks from which machine gun bursts, grenades, or rockets sprang and then closed again in silence. The mountain and the northern plateau were like invisible hives, impossible to reduce with artillery or aviation. The surface was destroyed again and again, but the enemy remained intact in their caves. The only way to confront this defense was to enter it. That was when the Marines discovered the horror of the war underground. The sappers, armed with flamethrowers and explosive charges, advanced toward the mouths of tunnels, often only a few meters from the beach or in the inner terraces. There, close-quarters battles took place where there was no room for strategy. Grenades were thrown blindly, liquid fire was sprayed into the passages, entrances were sealed with dynamite. The tunnels filled with smoke and muffled screams. Many Japanese defenders were buried alive under the rubble, and many Marines were blinded by smoke and ash. The flamethrower became the most feared and most used weapon. The operators advanced, crawling under incessant fire, with fuel tanks on their backs that could explode at the slightest impact. Upon reaching the mouth of a tunnel, they opened the valve and released blazing streams that traveled through entire passageways. The fire filled the caves, consumed the air, and turned the tunnels into ovens. Those who survived the fire were asphyxiated by the lack of oxygen. The spectacle was indescribable. Flames illuminating the night, black smoke rising from the earth as if the volcano had awakened again, charred bodies left in grotesque positions, soldiers emerging wrapped in flames, throwing themselves against the Marines before collapsing into ashes. But not even that was enough. Many tunnels had several entrances, and the Japanese reappeared through other mouths after having endured the fire. There were galleries so deep that they resisted bombardments from battleships and tons of napalm. At times, the Marines believed they had cleared a sector, only to be attacked from behind by men who had come out of a hidden passage. The feeling of insecurity was constant. There were no clear lines, there was no defined front. The enemy was below in any direction. The combats inside the galleries were a descent into nightmare. The darkness was total, barely broken by flashlights and flashes of gunfire. The air was unbreathable, filled with sulfur, sweat, and gunpowder. The men crawled through narrow passages where they could not fire long rifles, using knives, pistols, and hand grenades. There was no space to retreat. Whoever entered knew that they might not come out. Many Marines were trapped in explosions that collapsed ceilings of rock, and others simply disappeared into the gloom, never to be seen again by their companion. For the Japanese, life in those tunnels was a constant torment. They spent entire days without seeing the light, surrounded by corpses they could not bury, breathing humid air mixed with smoke and toxic gases. Water was rationed to the minimum, food scarce. Even so, they resisted with fanatical discipline. They knew they had no way out. There were no ships to evacuate. There were no reinforcements. Their world was that labyrinth, and there they were going to die. Many decorated the walls with messages for their families, with farewell poems or with imperial flags. Others kept grenades for the last instant, ready to immolate themselves when the Marines entered. The north of the island, with its hills called by the Americans Motoyama Plateau and Turkey Knob, was the heart of that war underground. There were concentrated the fiercest positions, with machine gun nests connected to tunnels that extended for kilometers. The Japanese artillery, fired from hidden galleries, emerged only for a few seconds and hid again before being detected. The Marines responded with everything they had: field artillery, naval fire, aerial bombardments. But it seemed useless. The Japanese always reappeared. It was like fighting against an enemy that multiplied in the shadows. The casualties were terrible. The doctors treated wounded men with dreadful burns, mutilations caused by grenades in closed spaces, suffocations from smoke. The field hospitals filled with traumatized men who trembled when remembering the darkness of the tunnels. Many were scarred for life, not by visible wounds, but by the memory of having fought underground, surrounded by screams and flames in a space where life seemed impossible. The most common method, in the end, was not to conquer the tunnels, but to seal them. The Marines began to use demolition charges to close entrances with tons of rock, burying alive those who were inside. It was a brutal but practical solution. It prevented them from reappearing and allowed the advance. However, this practice left thousands of Japanese defenders underground, trapped in galleries that became mausoleums. For years, the tunnels of Iwo Jima would continue to house remains of men who died in the darkness, without air, without water, waiting for an end that never came. The war underground was the most inhuman aspect of Iwo Jima. Nowhere else in the Pacific had the struggle reached that level of confinement, of immediate brutality, of combat without horizon or space. The Marines said that it was like fighting against the island itself, as if the rock and the volcano were alive. For the Japanese, it was the incarnation of their general's motto, to resist until the last breath, until the last corner, until the last tunnel. The ferocity hand to hand. If something distinguished Iwo Jima from other battles of the Pacific, it was the brutal closeness in which it was fought. The island was too small to establish clear front lines, and the Japanese tunnels made it impossible to know where an enemy position began or ended. The result was fighting at minimal distances, sometimes in the same hole, in the same trench, in the same cave. It was a war of broken breaths, of eyes that met 1 meter away, of weapons that could barely be raised before firing. The Marines were forced to adapt their method. The Garand rifle, excellent in open field, became uncomfortable in the narrow galleries and in the rock passages. Many preferred the M1 carbine, shorter, or even the Colt pistols. The decisive weapon, however, was the grenade. Each tunnel was cleaned with handfuls of fragmentation grenades, thrown one after another in suffocating darkness. After the explosions, the smoke filled the passage, and it was necessary to advance quickly. The surviving Japanese responded with their own grenades or with suicidal attack. The testimonies of the Marines coincide in that they had never seen such obstinate resistance. One of them wrote, "There were no lines, there were no safe zones. You could be drinking water with your squad, and suddenly a burst came out of a hole behind you. It was like fighting against the earth itself. You did not know from where the next bullet would come." Hand-to-hand combat took grotesque forms. In the caves lit by flames, men struggled with blows, using bayonets, K-bar knives, rifle butts. There were cases of Marines surprised in narrow passages where a shot would not fit. The fight was resolved in silence, with knives stabbed blindly, with bones broken under the pressure of an arm. The enemy did not surrender. He threw himself with a grenade in hand, or bit or tried to drag the other with him into hell. The flamethrowers became instruments of personal war. The operators advanced to the mouth of a tunnel and discharged liquid fire that ran through the passage, filling it with muffled screams. A Marine remembered, "I did not see anyone. I only heard screams like trapped animals. The fire swallowed the air, and then everything was silent. It was the only thing that worked, but every time we used the flamethrower, we felt that we were doing something that was not human." For the Japanese defenders, that struggle was the culmination of duty. Many had sworn not to return alive and awaited the moment to drag with them as many enemies as they could. The order of Kuribayashi to avoid massive banzai charges did not prevent the soldiers in desperate situations from resorting to individual explosions. They threw themselves against the Marines with grenades tied to the chest or pretended to be dead until a patrol approached. In the words of an American officer, "In Iwo Jima we learned to shoot at corpses because you never knew if they really were." The direct clash also left deep psychological marks. On the beach, the enemy was a distant target. Underground, on the other hand, it was a face that could be touched. The Marines remembered having smelled the Japanese sweat mixed with gunpowder, the heat of the breath in the darkness. One wrote in his diary, "I will never forget their eyes. They were not the eyes of a monster nor of a demon. They were of a man as scared as I was, but in that instant one had to die, and I was not going to be it." The nights were another hell. In the darkness, groups of Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels and infiltrated the American lines. They attacked command posts, field hospitals, ammunition depots. Many times the fighting was reduced to knife confrontations under the dim light of flares. The doctors, the stretcher-bearers, the cooks, all were forced to wield improvised weapons. A nurse remembered, "They came crawling among the wounded, throwing grenades among the stretchers. I myself fired a rifle that night. It was not a war, it was a slaughter in the middle of the laments." The exhaustion was unbearable. The advance was measured in meters, and every meter was sown with charred bodies, destroyed by grenades, mutilated by knives. Many Marines fell without time even to know what had killed them. The Japanese, for their part, fought until the last cartridge, until the last drop of blood. A prisoner who managed to be captured barely murmured, "We did not fight to live, but to die in the correct way." The hand-to-hand ferocity in Iwo Jima had no comparison. There was no open field nor retreat. There was the darkness of the tunnels, the black sand that swallowed the bodies, the unbearable closeness of an enemy who clung to life only to take it from others. For those who survived, those combats remained engraved as indelible nightmares. The face of the adversary centimeters away, the pressure of a hand on the throat, the explosion of a grenade at an arm's distance. Iwo Jima was more than a battle, a descent into the most primitive part of war, man against man, without barriers, without distance, without respite. A field of medals of honor. In Iwo Jima, death was so abundant that heroism seemed inevitable. The terrain, the tunnels, the enemy hidden in every crack forced the Marines to expose their lives again and again in gestures that in any other war would have been considered exceptional acts. There, however, they became daily routine. Not by chance that small volcanic island granted more medals of honor than any other battle in the history of the United States. 27 in total, many of them awarded posthumously. The phrase of Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, sums up what it meant. Among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. That statement was not a rhetorical exaggeration. It was the most faithful description of a battlefield where every meter conquered required that someone throw himself into death to open the way. The Marines advanced among craters and hills marked with names that would soon become synonymous with pain: meat grinder, turkey knob, amphitheater. In those places, Japanese resistance was so tight the companies were reduced to half in a few hours. To break the machine gun nests, someone had to rise under fire, run with explosives or a flamethrower and get close enough to eliminate the position. That action almost always ended in death, and yet ordinary men did it again and again. A Marine wrote in his diary, "What most surprised me was to see the quietest ones, those who never spoke, suddenly rise with a flamethrower or a box of grenades and throw themselves forward, knowing they would not return. Nobody forced them. They simply did it because someone had to do it." Among the names that remained engraved in memory is that of Sergeant Darren Cole, who led his squad under intense fire and, when all were trapped, advanced alone against Japanese positions, throwing grenades with precision until silencing several machine guns. He died before returning, but his action allowed his men to survive. The case is also told of Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, flamethrower operator who crawled for hours among craters, burning one camouflaged bunker after another. With only a handful of volunteers covering him, he crossed open zones under direct fire, returning several times to refill his fuel tank. He survived, and with him survived dozens of comrades who were able to advance thanks to his obstinacy. Another brutal example is that of soldier Jack Lucas, barely a 17-year-old adolescent. During combat in a trench, 2 Japanese grenades fell between him and his comrades. Without thinking, he threw himself upon them, covering them with his body. Miraculously, he survived, though gravely wounded, and became one of the youngest to receive the Medal of Honor. The accounts of those who were witnesses speak of gestures that seemed superhuman. An officer wrote, "It was as if every man knew that he had to do something more than what was expected. Not for glory, but because there was no other choice. I saw men run into fire to drag a wounded man. I saw Marines who refused to be evacuated until their squad was safe. Anywhere else they would be heroes. In Iwo Jima they were simply Marines." The chaplain of the 5th Division, who toured the island giving spiritual aid, noted in his notebook, "The bodies were so mixed with the sand that sometimes you did not know whether you were embracing a living man or a dead one. Yet even in that hell, men rose to cover their comrades. I have never seen such a quantity of valor concentrated in one single place. Every medal awarded carried behind it an unbearable cost. Most of those decorated died in the action that earned them recognition. The awarding of those medals years later was often done into the hands of mothers, wives, or brothers who could barely hold them through tears. For many veterans, the decorations were not a source of pride but of silence. They said that the true heroes were those who did not return. A survivor, decades later, confessed, "The island was full of heroes but also full of graves. Every story of a Medal of Honor was written with the blood of someone who did not return with us. I never felt worthy of standing beside those men." The field of Iwo Jima, with its blackened slopes and its sealed tunnels, was an altar of sacrifice where the word valor lost its usual meaning. There, the heroic became the everyday. The Medal of Honor, the highest recognition, was awarded so many times that it seemed almost an extension of the uniform, not because the war was less cruel, but because cruelty forced each soldier to give more than what seemed possible. The result was a landscape marked by sacrifice. Every hill conquered carried the name of a man who had thrown himself into fire. Every meter gained was written with acts of a ferocity and a dedication that no military manual could foresee. In Iwo Jima, the entire island became a field of medals of honor, where heroism was confused with desperation and blood with black sand. The Japanese sacrifice. The defense of Iwo Jima was conceived from the beginning as an act of absolute sacrifice. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, upon receiving the mission to protect the island, knew that he could not win. Without a fleet, without aviation, and without reinforcements, the order he transmitted to his men was simple and terrifying. Resist until the end, make the enemy pay the highest possible price, die with honor on the land of the emperor. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers who set foot on the island, barely a few hundred survived as prisoners. The rest remained buried under the black sand in the tunnels or on the slopes of Suribachi. For the defenders, the sacrifice was not a consequence, was the objective. From the first days, Kuribayashi prohibited the suicidal banzai charges that had characterized previous battles, such as Saipan or Tarawa. He knew that those offensives could be heroic, but also useless. He wanted each Japanese soldier to kill 10 Marines before falling, for each bullet to find a target, for each position to resist until the last cartridge. That is why he built the tunnels. That is why he forced his men to survive underground for entire weeks, enduring hunger, thirst, darkness, and the stench of piled bodies. The letters left by some soldiers reveal the spirit of resignation that dominated the garrison. A young officer wrote to his mother, "I will not see you again. My body will remain on this island, but my spirit will take care of the home. Do not cry for me. I feel happy to give my life for the emperor." Another, before entering combat, wrote in a notebook that was later found in a cave, "The enemy is strong, we are few, but I will die content if I manage to stop even one of them." The Japanese sacrifice was also physical at a level that the Marines could hardly comprehend. The defenders lived without fresh water. They drank what little they could distill from the rocks, shared minimal rations of rice or preserves, sometimes cooked with the suffocating smoke of sulfur torches. They slept crowded in tunnels where the temperature was stifling, with the air filled with humidity and volcanic gases. Many spent weeks without seeing the sunlight, with their skin covered in soot and dust, with sick lungs. And even so, when the moment of battle came, they came out of their caves to fire with the same discipline as the first day. The Marines who survived the combat were marked by that obstinacy. One of them confessed years later, "I did not understand how they could keep fighting without water, without food, without hope. It was as if they had renounced life before even starting. They did not fight to win, they fought to die in the way they thought correct." That perception was repeated among all. The Japanese did not ask for surrender, did not seek to escape, did not accept negotiation. They simply fought until the grenade in the hand exploded, until the bullet in the magazine was exhausted, until the tunnel collapsed over their bodies. The sacrifice took individual forms that shocked even the enemies. Wounded soldiers who crawled to the American positions only to detonate a grenade under their body. Snipers who remained hidden for days without moving until they were discovered surrounded by the corpses of comrades. Entire groups who entrenched themselves in a cave, rejecting any attempt of capture, and who finally blew themselves up with explosives, turning the grotto into a collective tomb. A Japanese prisoner, captured badly wounded, explained with a broken voice, "Our duty was not to return, our duty was to die. If we fell alive, it was shame for our families." These words were confirmed in this. Most of the soldiers preferred death before being captured. The few who survived did so unconscious, too weak to commit suicide, or because they had been buried underground and were found after the combat. The sealed tunnels became symbols of that sacrifice. When the Marines closed an opening with explosives, they knew that inside remained dozens, sometimes hundreds of Japanese soldiers trapped without exit. Screams were heard, blows on the walls, farewell songs. Some witnesses remembered having heard patriotic hymns that arose from the rock before slowly fading, suffocated by the lack of oxygen. Each closed tunnel was a mass grave, a collective sacrifice that the Japanese accepted with fatalistic resignation. The Japanese sacrifice in Iwo Jima was not only military but also spiritual. For them, the island was homeland soil, part of the sacred archipelago. To defend it was equivalent to protecting the gateway to the homeland, the very frontier of the empire. To die there was more than an obligation, it was a privilege. One of the last messages sent from Kuribayashi's headquarters said, "We have become a wall of stone to protect Japan. Here we will remain, firm until the wind wears us away." When the battle ended, the Marines occupied an island that seemed an open cemetery. Among the sealed tunnels, the smoking craters and the scattered bodies, they understood that they had faced not only an army but a will of absolute sacrifice. The 21,000 men sent to defend Iwo Jima did not return home. Their sacrifice remained buried under the black sand, merged with the volcanic rock, mingled forever with the fate of the island. Our Japanese voices from the entrails of Iwo Jima. The words that remained in letters, diaries, and statements of Japanese prisoners are the most brutal proof of what it meant to resist in Iwo Jima. They did not speak from the pride of the victor, nor from the distance of the analyst, but from the darkness of the tunnels, with the certainty that they would not come out alive. A private wrote to his family before communications were cut, "The sun no longer rises for us. We live underground, where the air is heavy and smells of death. We hear the enemy walking above our heads, but we cannot come out yet. Soon the moment to die will arrive, and I do not fear. I only think of you, Mother, and of the cherry trees of our village that I will never see again." Another, whose notebook was found in a sealed cave, left an almost poetic description of the torment. "The island is a hell. The ground spits fire, and the sky is covered with smoke. Our bodies are tired, our throats dry, but we still have ammunition, and as long as one bullet remains, the enemy will not pass. If we fall, we will do so with our heads held high, like samurai in the era of iron and fire." The testimonies collected from the few prisoners were even more heartbreaking. A young man, barely 20 years old, confessed through tears, "I wanted to die with my comrades, but I lost consciousness because of the smoke. When I awoke, I was already in the hands of the enemy. I do not deserve to see my family again. They expected wanted my death, not my capture," another prisoner said with a broken voice. "We listened as the Americans sealed the entrances. Our officers ordered us to sing while the air ran out. Many died standing, singing the imperial anthem. The vision of death as duty appears in every memory." An artillery officer, in a letter never sent, wrote, "There is no hope of victory. Nevertheless, to die here is to serve our emperor better than in 100 battles. I do not think of returning, only that my death may serve so that Japan lives one more day." Even in the midst of despair, humanity persisted. A diary found in the northern plateau contained simple lines. "Today I dreamed of hot rice. Today I thought of my little sister. Today I heard the laughter of a comrade before the shrapnel silenced him. Everything already seems like a dream." The Marines who found those notes were impressed by the mixture of discipline, sadness, and fatalism. One of them, upon reading the letter of a fallen soldier, wrote in his own notebook, "I cannot hate them after reading this. They fight with a courage I do not understand, but that I respect. We fight to return home. They fight because they know they will not." The Japanese voices of Iwo Jima are echoes trapped in the volcanic rock, words that should never have been heard by their families, but that survived among the ash. They reflect not only obedience to the motto of dying, but also the fragility of men who still thought of cherry trees, of rice, of the warmth of a home they knew was lost. The end of the battle and the destiny of Iwo Jima. On March 26th of 1945, after 36 days of fighting, the United States officially declared the island of Iwo Jima secured. By then, the volcanic landscape had become unrecognizable. Collapsed tunnels, blackened slopes, beaches covered with charred remains, and a stench that impregnated everything. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, barely 400 were captured alive. The rest remained in their sealed tunnels, in improvised graves, or in the battlefields that still smoke. On the American side, the victory had cost more than 6,800 dead and more than 19,000 wounded, a proportion of casualties that shook even the military commands accustomed to the brutality of the Pacific. The last days of the battle were as ferocious as the first. Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, maintained organized resistance until mid-March, transmitting messages that reflected more determination than despair. His men withdrew to the north, defending each hill, each trench, each tunnel mouth. On March 25th, one day before the official declaration of American victory, a group of almost 300 Japanese launched a nocturnal counterattack against a service camp behind the lines, killing more than 100 Marines and support workers before being annihilated. It was the last eruption of a human volcano that refused to be extinguished. Kuribayashi died in combat, probably in the north of the island, although his body was never identified with certainty. When the last shot went silent, the Marines contemplated a terrain that seemed more an open wound than a conquered island. They had expected an airfield that would serve as a springboard, and what they found was a gigantic tomb. The immediate task was to transform that cemetery into an operational base. The Navy engineers began to repair and extend the airfields of Motoyama, whose volcanic surface was ideal for resistant runways. The noise of bulldozers and pneumatic hammers replaced that of artillery, while the corpses were buried in endless rows and the tunnels were definitively sealed. The true strategic value of Iwo Jima was revealed weeks later. For the High Command, the island was an intermediate point between the Marianas and the Japanese archipelago. There, the P-51 Mustang fighters could land that would escort the B-29 in their raids over Tokyo and other industrial cities. Before having the base in Iwo, the long-range bombers took off from Guam, Saipan, or Tinian and traveled almost 3,000 kilometers to Japan. Their problem was not so much to reach the target, to return. Any malfunction or damage in combat condemned them to fall into the sea without possible salvation. With Iwo Jima secured, that equation equation changed. From March of 1945, the B-29 began to use its runways as an emergency point. In the following months, more than 2,400 bombers landed there with damaged engines, perforated tanks, or wounded crews. Each one of those landings meant dozens of lives saved. A pilot remembered, "We knew that if we reached Iwo, there was hope. To see the black spot of the island in the middle of the ocean was like seeing life return." Many crew members descended crying, thanking not only the engineers who had enabled the runways, but also the Marines who had paid with blood the right to use them. In addition to serving as an emergency base, Iwo Jima became a starting point for the squadrons of P-51 fighters. Their radius of action allowed them to escort the B-29 to the skies of Japan, reducing losses against the fierce Japanese air defense. The fighters took off from the volcanic island again and again, protecting the bombers in their transit toward the massive bombings of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other cities. The island, once a cursed rock, was transformed into a deadly springboard that extended the reach of American air power. The missions from Iwo Jima multiplied during the following month. The improvised hangars housed dozens of aircraft, while the fuel and ammunition depots filled sectors that weeks earlier had been battlefield. The soldiers who remained on the island lived with the ghosts of the battle. Tunnels that still smelled of death, bodies that continued to appear under the sand, Japanese inscriptions on the walls that spoke of sacrifice and farewells. Some Marines confessed to feeling that they slept over a cemetery. The island never stopped reminding them that it was covered with bones. The intensive use of Iwo Jima had a direct impact on the final phase of the war. The incendiary bombing missions that devastated Tokyo in March of 1945 and the systematic attacks against the Japanese cities were possible in part thanks to the security that the island offered. Thousands of B-29 crews were able to return thanks to it, and the casualty numbers in American aviation decreased drastically. In the summer of that same year, the preparations for the invasion of Okinawa and later for Operation Downfall, the plan of invasion of Japan itself, counted on Iwo Jima as an essential piece in the aerial rear. The human cost, however, remained impossible to ignore. For many American soldiers, the question was inevitable: was it worth it? More than 26,000 casualties for an island of barely 20 kilometers square. The commanders responded that yes, that the lives saved of the B-29 crews far outweighed the initial losses. Later historians calculate that more than 25,000 airmen benefited from the emergency runways of Iwo Jima, and that without the island, the aerial losses would have been catastrophic. For the families of those fallen on the black sand, that justification was often insufficient. Meanwhile, Japan never forgot the sacrifice of its defenders. For the Japanese people, Iwo Jima became a symbol of absolute devotion, a place where young men gave their lives without hope of victory. The remains of thousands remained underground, in tunnels that even decades later were explored to recover bones and personal objects. The island, officially renamed Kyoto in 2007, remains a sacred memorial for Japan and a cemetery for the United States. The end of the battle did not bring silence, but a new stage of military use. In the following months, Iwo Jima resounded not with artillery, but with the engines of the B-29 that ascended northward. It was the constant hum of a war that was heading inexorably toward its climax. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the surrender of Japan in August of 1945. Iwo Jima had been conquered at an immeasurable price, but it became a decisive cog in the outcome of the war. The end of the battle did not mean the end of suffering on the island. Many Marines remained there for months, building and defending the airbase. They walked over sealed tunnels that still held the trapped Japanese, and sometimes the ground sank, revealing human remains. Each patrol found relics, helmets, rusty weapons, soaked diaries, bones blackened by fire. The memory of the combat was so present that no one could speak of the island without feeling the weight of death. Ultimately, Iwo Jima was at the same time a strategic victory, a collective sacrifice, and an eternal wound. It ended up being used as the strategists had planned, as a lifeline for the bombers and a base for the escort fighters. But for those who fought there, and for those who never returned, the island remained marked as the place where blood, ash, and the burning sky mingled in a battle that never ceased to resonate in the memory of all who survived it.